When royal aides discovered that Catherine's name had quietly vanished from a set of high-level palace documents, no one could have predicted the firestorm it would ignite. What began as a simple clerical confusion quickly unraveled into a plot so calculated, so personal, that even the most seasoned courtiers were left speechless. And at the center, Camilla, shielded by power, now implicated by paper. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began with a single envelope left unsigned, a diplomatic itinerary meant to be reviewed and stamped for an upcoming state visit, curiously omitted Catherine's name where protocol demanded her presence as the Princess of Wales. Aide after aide insisted it was an error, an oversight, perhaps the fault of a junior clerk. But Anne noticed, and when she asked quietly behind the scenes, the answers were vague, rehearsed, and disturbingly inconsistent. What should have been a routine document had exposed a fracture small, yes, but too sharp to ignore. At first, whispers of the incident were confined to private corridors. But Anne, always perceptive, knew this wasn't the first time Catherine had been inexplicably excluded. She recalled an earlier program where Catherine's seating had been quietly changed without notice, and another where her role in a ceremonial function was publicly minimized. These weren't coincidences, they were patterns. The more Anne examined, the more she found. Internal palace documents had begun favoring Camilla's presence in areas previously shared or led by Catherine. And not just in ceremonies across media briefings, engagement listings, and even internal HR planning. Behind closed doors, Camilla's influence had surged. Staff now referred to her office as the clearinghouse. For consort activity, an informal gatekeeper role that allowed her team to review, delay, or alter royal plans often without needing Charles's explicit approval. And though the king was aware of Camilla's growing command, he seemed curiously detached, offering neither support nor resistance as protocols subtly shifted. It was as if, in the absence of Elizabeth, no one dared challenge the consort's momentum, no one but Anne. While the public continued to see carefully crafted smiles between the two women, behind palace walls, the distance had grown colder. Their engagements were fewer, conversations clipped, and the rare moments they were photographed together felt as staged as the portraits behind them. Something unspoken had begun to fester, a rivalry not of glamour or popularity, but of position, permanence, and power. Anne sensed it, felt it, and unlike the others refused to dismiss it, because Anne knew the truth. This wasn't about Catherine being forgotten. It was about her being removed, one edit at a time. And in a monarchy built on precision, omission was never accidental, it was intentional. It was a warning. But what Anne would uncover next wouldn't just expose a mistake, it would unravel a campaign built on exclusion, power, and a fear of legacy. Buried in the palace's archival wing, a place few ever access, Princess Anne discovered a folder misfiled deep within the royal household's restricted communication log. Inside were not just redacted pages, but correspondence. That suggested something far more sinister than mere oversight. Camilla hadn't just edited Catherine out, she'd initiated an entire strategy of quiet erasure. Anne had seen enough inconsistencies to abandon any belief that this was coincidence. What she uncovered in that misfiled folder was far more than an administrative blunder. It was a blueprint, meticulously crafted and quietly executed. The first document was dated 18 months prior, marked internal eyes only, and carried an unassuming title, Seniority Reassessment Proposal. Buried within its bureaucratic phrasing was a startling phrase, future ceremonial visibility based on current consort hierarchy. It was a subtle, almost invisible suggestion. But Anne read between the lines. It meant Catherine would no longer be automatically prioritized in upcoming state events, not by virtue of her title, but by selective interpretation of precedents. But the paper trail didn't stop there. Other pages revealed more disturbing truths. Some of Catherine's long-standing patronages had been internally reassigned without her knowledge. Charitable events that had always been earmarked for the Princess of Wales were suddenly diverted to Camilla or her inner circle. These weren't ceremonial handovers. They were quiet displacements. And at the bottom of several memos sat an all-too-familiar initial, C.H. Camilla's private secretary. The signature wasn't always bold, but the pattern was unmistakable. With each stroke of the pen, Catherine role was being shaved away subtly, methodically, and without public scrutiny. It wasn't just a single hand guiding these changes. Anne's further digging pointed to the existence of a shadow advisory body, a loosely formed group of long-serving courtiers, and Camilla's confidants, unofficial but deeply influential. Whispers in the corridors referred to it mockingly as the Consort Council, though its impact was no joke. They didn't issue orders, but their notes influenced decisions, altered protocols, and suggested modernized visibility strategies that always seemed to elevate Camilla while diminishing Catherine. Every move was cloaked in plausible deniability, every alteration made just subtle enough to avoid alarm. And yet Anne did not confront, not yet. This wasn't a moment for accusations, it was a moment for strategy. She knew Camilla wouldn't be reckless. If there was a plan unfolding, there would be more evidence, and Anne intended to gather all of it before striking. She began copying pages quietly, tracking signatures, noting the chain of approvals. She kept her circle small, her suspicions quieter still. Because Anne understood what was at stake. This wasn't just politics, it was legacy manipulation. And as Anne traced the paper trail back to its source, what she found hidden in the margins pointed to a plan that had already begun. To the public, nothing had changed. But behind palace gates, Catherine's titles were quietly dissolving. One by one, they disappear. D from programs, press drafts, and future state planning documents, until it became undeniable. Someone was rewriting the script of royal precedents, and Catherine wasn't being warned. She was being erased. At first it was subtle. A missing mention in a briefing note. A program for a Commonwealth reception that listed Camilla, but not Catherine, despite her prior commitment to the cause. Then came the palace's official calendar. Catherine's name appeared less frequently, and when it did, the positioning had shifted. Gone were the clear indicators of her seniority. Her formal styling was replaced with vague references. These weren't oversights, they were patterns. And within the palace, staff had started to notice. But no one dared speak openly. The atmosphere had grown heavy with quiet compliance. The whispers in the corridors were cautious, coded, and always ended with the same resignation. Camilla's team had eyes and ears everywhere. Catherine, though poised in public, felt the pressure closing in. Her staff grew unusually reserved. Her briefings lacked clarity. And each week there seemed to be a new surprise, a patronage reshuffled, a photo omitted, a ceremonial plan rewritten. She remained silent until one evening, when the facade cracked. In a private room with William, her voice trembled as she asked a question no future queen should ever have to ask. Am I being replaced? William's reaction was immediate, protective, enraged, and quietly shaken. He assured her it was absurd. But when he took the concern to Charles, the king's response was evasive, dismissive. Let the press office handle it, Charles muttered. No acknowledgement, no clarity, just a refusal to engage. That silence said more than words ever could. Meanwhile, reports had begun to circulate internally. Camilla was exerting increasing influence over who accompanied the king to official functions. Protocol, long governed by rigid precedents, was now subject to preference. And the preference was clear. Catherine was being sidelined. She wasn't barred, just quietly displaced. The palace's own logistics team began receiving directives through Camilla's office, sometimes bypassing William's team entirely. The hierarchy was shifting, not by public decree, but by internal maneuvering. Every decision seemed minor in isolation, but collectively, they formed a pattern too intentional to ignore. The emotional toll on Catherine was immense. Always measured, always composed, she now found herself battling an invisible campaign, one she couldn't prove, but felt in every interaction. Each day brought a new erasure, a new omission, a fresh sting cloaked in diplomacy. And through it all, she remained silent, unwilling to fracture the public image of unity. But Anne saw it. She saw the exhaustion in Catherine's eyes, the quiet hurt hidden behind each public smile, and while others averted their gaze, Anne sharpened hers. Because this wasn't just about Catherine, it was about power disguised as traditi. On. And as Catherine struggled in silence, Anne decided silence was no longer an option, and what she did next changed everything. Anne had seen enough. Known for her stoic resolve, the Princess Royal shattered protocol with a private confrontation that stunned even Charles. But this wasn't just about Catherine. It was about loyalty, legacy, and the very future of the monarchy. And in that moment, Anne chose clarity over comfort. The meeting wasn't scheduled. It wasn't requested. It was demanded. Entered Charles's private study with a folder in hand and fire in her voice. She didn't soften her tone, didn't wait for formalities. She placed the evidence before her brother, the redacted drafts, the communication logs, the internal memos where Catherine's name had been systematically removed or repositioned. Charles, caught off guard, tried to deflect. His instinct was defense. "I'm not aware of the specifics," he muttered. But Anne didn't come for evasion. She came for truth, and she wasn't leaving without it. Charles shifted in his chair as Anne laid out the pattern how Camilla's influence had extended beyond ceremonial matters, how protocols were being rewritten without royal consensus, how Catherine, the Princess of Wales, was being deliberately sidelined in documents that bore the King's seal. At first, Charles dismissed it as bureaucratic friction. "Departments overlap," he said. "There's always duplication." But Anne pushed harder, unrelenting. "This isn't duplication," she snapped. "This is deletion." Her voice trembled not with anger but with purpose. She reminded him that public trust didn't rely on surface smiles, but on the consistency of roles, that every omission sent a message, and that the monarchy could not afford the appearance of internal sabotage. Faced with mounting proof, Charles hesitated. His loyalty to Camilla, unspoken yet unshaken, clouded his judgment. He asked for time, clarity, patience, but Anne saw through it. She knew indecision was a decision. So she changed course, not to threaten, but to prepare. Quietly, she brought William into the fold. Late one evening, she met with him behind closed doors. She revealed the evidence, the edits, the truth Charles wouldn't face. William didn't speak for a long time. But his silence was not uncertainty, it was focus. The alliance between Anne and William didn't need public announcement. It was forged in shared purpose and silent resolve. Meanwhile, Camilla remained unaware. She believed her strategy remained undiscovered, her influence unchallenged. She continued to maneuver with confidence, assuming her moves were invisible. But she had underestimated Anne. Because this was no longer a question of status, it was a battle for narrative. And Anne wasn't acting alone anymore. She had ignited something, an undercurrent of resistance that would not stop at confrontation, but move toward correction. But as Anne pressed forward, Camilla was already preparing her next move, a counter-move row. Oated not in panic, but entitlement. Far from retreating, Camilla doubled down. Behind closed doors, she convened a circle of trusted loyalists, senior aides, aristocratic allies, and former retainers of the Queen Mother. Their mission was simple: secure her legacy, silence dissent, and ensure that Catherine's rising popularity didn't eclipse her own reign. The meetings were discreet, held in the quiet drawing rooms of Clarence House and masked as routine planning sessions. But behind the locked doors, a strategy was being written, calculated, ruthless, and cloaked in noble language. They called it Preserve the Crown's Consort, a coded initiative aimed not at serving the monarchy, but at solidifying Camilla's personal position within it. At its core was a singular fear that Catherine, with her grace, youth, and connection to Diana's memory, would eventually outshine and outrank Camilla in both public affection and symbolic power. That fear, left unchecked, hardened into policy. The plan was layered. First came the press. Camilla's aides began selectively leaking to friendly journalists short blurbs hinting at Catherine's growing distance from court, her reduced workload, and her preference for privacy. The palace press office was left scrambling, often unaware of the source or timing of these pieces. At public events, reporters were subtly redirected toward Camilla's schedule. Photos of her engagements were prioritized, even when Catherine's moments carried more significance. Slowly, perception began to shift, not drastically, but enough to muddy the waters. Then came the whisper campaign. Certain circles of the aristocracy, particularly those who had long held ties to the Queen Mother, were tapped to influence elite opinion. Comments were made at charity galas, murmurs planted at luncheons, private doubts raised in parliamentary circles. Is Catherine really prepared for what's coming? She's elegant, yes, but distant. Too reserved to truly step into the Queen's shoes. The language was always subtle, always deniable, but always coordinated. Camilla believed in tradition, but only the parts of it that served her. In her view, seniority meant superiority. Age brought legitimacy. She saw Catherine's popularity as a threat to that model, a shift towards celebrity over service. To her, this wasn't personal. It was preservation. She was not trying to destroy Catherine, she was trying to survive her. But while Camilla orchestrated her moves with the confidence of someone certain of victory, she failed to see the quiet resistance building beneath her feet. Anne had her own eyes within Clarence's house. Old alliances, quiet staffers, and former military aides kept her informed, piece by piece. Every whisper reached her desk. Every leaked email found its way back. And while Camilla believed her strategy remained airtight, Anne was already preparing to turn that very strategy inside out. Because what Camilla hadn't calculated was that the next blow wouldn't come from the press, the palace, or Charles. It would come from Catherine herself. Catherine never raised her voice. She didn't need to. In a carefully choreographed moment, she delivered a silent blow that left the royal press corps stunned and Camilla off balance. One gesture, one appearance, and the public saw everything they needed to know. For weeks, she had watched the quiet erasures, endured the sidelining, and bore the weight of silence with dignity. But dignity is not weakness. When the time came, Catherine didn't seek confrontation, she embodied command. Without prior announcement, she arrived at a high-profile Commonwealth reception that neither Charles nor Camilla was expected to attend. Alone, without entourage, without preamble, she stepped into the spotlight with the full force of history behind her. The entire room paused. Cameras flashed. And it wasn't just her presence that stunned them, it was what she chose to wear. A subtle nod to Queen Elizabeth's early reign, carefully chosen for symbolism, whispered everything without a single word spoken. The statement was unmistakable. Legacy, not leverage, would define her role. The response was instant and electrifying. Headlines pivoted within hours. Catherine commands the room. The people's future queen reclaims her place. Social media ignited with praise and solidarity. While Camilla had worked to steer the narrative behind closed doors, Catherine had rewritten it in one public heartbeat. It was calm, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. Inside palace walls, senior courtiers traded whispers behind oak doors. That wasn't grace. That was strategy. Another muttered what others feared to say aloud. That was no accident. That was war. Even Charles, observing from Sandringham, was said to be quietly moved. He reportedly told a senior aide that was poise under pressure. It wasn't a declaration of allegiance, but it was the closest he had come to acknowledging the cost of silence and the strength it takes to break it without breaking order. In one calculated move, Catherine had reclaimed not only visibility but relevance. Her power wasn't inherited. It was displayed. Camilla, by contrast, felt the shift immediately. For the first time in months, her influence over the narrative slipped. The press no longer hung on her movements. Her office issued a clumsy statement congratulating Catherine on her graceful representation of the crown. But even her allies knew the tone was forced. Camilla was rattled not because Catherine had defied her, but because she'd done it without words, without conflict, and without ever acknowledging the campaign that had tried to erase her. The monarchy thrives on symbolism, and Catherine had just delivered one of the most powerful in a generation. She had not only stepped back into the frame, she had redrawn it. And while the public celebrated her return to prominence, another figure moved quietly behind the scenes. Because just as the Public rallied around Catherine. Anne prepared her final reveal, the one piece of evidence that couldn't be ignored. Locked in a restricted archive was a letter never meant to be seen, redacted in parts, signed off by Camilla's aide, and marked with the Queen's seal. It was Anne's smoking gun, and when she delivered it to Charles, the monarch was forced to confront a truth he could no longer deny. The letter was brief, clinical in tone, and devastating in implication. It authorized what it called structural adjustments to ceremonial orders language, deliberately vague, deliberately safe. But Anne had read enough to know where to look. Beneath the formal phrasing was a chilling clarity. Specific references to the Princess of Wales had been removed, replaced with neutral descriptors that stripped the role of rank and recognition. This wasn't streamlining, this was demotion by paperwork. The authority line traced back to Camilla's office, approved through her private secretary, then quietly folded into official circulation as if it were routine. When Charles read it, the shift was immediate. His composure faltered. This wasn't hearsay. This wasn't interpretation. It was evidence bearing the seal of the crown, altered without his explicit consent, but executed in his name. For a long moment he said nothing. His silence wasn't confusion, it was reckoning. Betrayal settled in slowly, not with anger, but with the heavy realization that control had slipped from his grasp while he was looking the other way. Camilla, summoned and confronted, moved quickly into defense. She spoke of misunderstandings, of overzealous aides, of intentions twisted by miscommunication. She insisted the letter was never meant to diminish Catherine, only to clarify ceremonial efficiency. But Anne didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply pointed to the margins, to the removed titles, to the deliberate absence of language that had defined Catherine's role for years. And then she said the words that froze the room. "You knew exactly what this would do." There was no reply strong enough to counter that, because intention was no longer in question. Impact was. William, who had remained silent until now, finally stepped forward. His voice was steady, controlled, but unmistakably firm. He declared that this could no longer be handled quietly, behind closed doors and selective edits. The family needed to meet, fully, honestly. No intermediaries, no deflections. What had been hidden in files and footnotes had now reached a breaking point. The room felt smaller after that. Lines were drawn not by volume, but by position. Loyalty versus legacy, control versus continuity. Charles, caught between the woman he loved and the institution he served, understood what this moment demanded, even if he feared what it would cost. Because once documents surface, once truth hardens into proof, there is no returning to silence. And with the family now divided and the public watching closely, the final showdown was no longer avoidable. It was inevitable. In the secluded halls of Balmoral, the royal family gathered under the guise of retreat. But behind those stone walls, titles were defended, accusations unleashed, and the crown itself trembled under the weight of truth. This wasn't just about documents, it was about inheritance, relevance, and respect. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Anne arrived first, silent, resolute, holding nothing but the weight of what had been uncovered. William and Catherine followed, unshaken in their unity, yet visibly exhausted by the battle that had been fought in whispers and shadows. Then came Charles, torn between roles he no longer controlled, and Camilla gripping onto dignity that now rested on crumbling ground. This wasn't a formal meeting, it was an intervention disguised as tradition. Balmoral, long a place of peace and reflection, had become the theatre for reckoning. Camilla broke first. She stood before them, composed yet visibly strained, and offered her version of events not as a confession but as a defense. "I was protecting the monarchy's structure," she insisted, framing her decisions as strategic adjustments made in service to continuity and clarity. But the room didn't flinch. William met her gaze without hesitation. "No," he said, his voice quiet but sharp. "You were protecting yourself." The words hung in the air like frost. There was no raising of voices, no storm of insults, just the devastating simplicity of truth spoken aloud in front of those who could no longer afford to pretend. Charles, caught between the only woman who had ever truly understood him and the son who bore the future of the monarchy, remained silent for longer than anyone expected. His hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from the impossible choice laid before him. In the end, it wasn't loyalty that swayed him, it was legacy. He looked to Anne, the one constant force of discipline and duty, then to Catherine, who had endured humiliation not with retaliation, but with unshakable grace. Finally, he nodded once, a small act with irreversible consequences. It was agreed. Catherine's full ceremonial role would be restored immediately, and all prior adjustments, withdrawn. Her name would return to official programs, her precedence reinstated without ambiguity. It wasn't framed as a correction, it was declared a recognition of error and a reaffirmation of place. Camilla, still cloaked in calmness, agreed to step back from certain state matters specifically. All internal document approval involving the Princess of Wales. No formal apology was offered. None was expected. The compromise was delicate, but it was decisive. The monarchy had bent but not broken. The scars from this quiet civil war would not be shown to the public, but within Balmoral, every glance, every word, every pause had carved a new truth into the family's foundation. What had begun as a whisper of exclusion had ended in a royal reckoning. But even as the dust settled and Catherine's name returned to the papers, one chilling truth remained. Trust had been broken and Anne wasn't finished yet. Months later, Anne handed a sealed envelope to Catherine. Inside was a diary page written by Queen Elizabeth II, long before her passing. It spoke of balance, duty, and a quiet warning. There will come a time when the Queen must watch the Queen. And in that moment, Catherine understood the battle was far from over. The paper was aged but firm, the writing unmistakably the Queen's, precise, considered, and deeply private. It wasn't meant for public eyes. It wasn't even meant to be shared. But Anne had kept it, tucked away in a folder of guarded reflections passed between mother and daughter in quiet moments at Windsor. The words carried weight not because of who had written them, but because of when. Long before Camilla's title was formalized, long before Catherine became Princess of Wales. It was a prophecy written in ink, one that now felt chillingly accurate. The Queen had seen the cracks before anyone dared name them. She had warned of the moment when duty would no longer be inherited but contested, a moment when crowns would sit uneasily, and those who wore them would begin watching each other as closely as the world watched them. As Catherine read the entry in silence, her expression didn't falter, but her eyes held something different. Not sadness, not anger, but understanding. The past months hadn't been a misstep in protocol. They had been a test, and not just of survival but of evolution. Camilla had not simply sought influence. She had made a move to shape legacy in real time. And Catherine, by enduring it, had not only exposed it, she had learned from it. The diary wasn't a comfort, it was a call. Anne didn't say much. She didn't have to. Her final words to Catherine echoed not as instruction but as a challenge. Now you know, what you do next is up to you. It was both a passing of the torch and a reminder that in this family, foresight was more powerful than force. Anne had played her role. She had exposed the architecture of quiet betrayal. But the future wasn't hers to carry. It belonged to Catherine now and Catherine alone. In the days that followed, Catherine returned to public life with the same elegance, the same smile, the same measured steps. But those who looked closely saw a shift, not in her demeanor, but in her awareness. The innocence of order had faded. In its place stood intention. She no longer mistook silence for peace. She no longer viewed the crown as armor. She saw it now for what it truly was, a target and a weapon, depending on who wielded it. And as she stood alone in a private chamber, looking out over the Buckingham skyline, she didn't see ceremony, she saw strategy. Because in this monarchy, power isn't just worn. It's protected, it's claimed, and it's watched. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.